and this maybe goes back more to what you're saying about the embarrassment stuff. No one's ever died of embarrassment. No one's ever died from frustration, and I think it is very frustrating. I don't know, it was somewhere around then when I started just fully thinking in Spanish. When I'm in the Spanish speaking world, I'm thinking in Spanish. And I did get to kinda jump that with Portuguese because, again, they're so similar.
Welcome to the MindHack podcast. I'm your host, Cody McLean, and today we're exploring the fascinating journey of language learning and cultural connection. I'm with Michael Sullivan, a language teacher who went from a boring middle school Spanish class in St. Louis to going on an epic quest across the Americas. While most of us are struggling with Donde está la biblioteca, Michael has been laying the groundwork for what would become a masterful command of multiple languages. He's a pioneering language educator who's cracked the code on making learning a language actually fun. In an era where everyone's relying on Google Translate, Michael's proven that real human connection through language is what separates the tourists from the true cultural ambassadors. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Cody, thanks for having me. Those are, very kind words in that introduction there.
Yeah, and we know each other as I take a weekly Spanish lesson with you, and I think you're just amazing and how you're able to break down so many components of learning a language. And I know when I started out, I've been doing Duolingo for just a very long time, well over a year. I mean, I've completed the entire course on Duolingo for Spanish, and I still feel like I can't hold an actual conversation with somebody in Spanish. Why do you think so many people struggle with learning a language, and why do these platforms not seem to work?
I think people struggle with learning second or third language or whatever, because it's hard. It's definitely something that we're all capable of doing, but it's a lot of work. I think what often happens is that we need a lot of study time and we need a lot of exposure. And if we don't, if a lot of us have full-time lives and we don't live, maybe we don't have that ready exposure of being able to speak and to be able to listen and to speak just all the time. And that's how we learned our first language, just absolute immersion. The reason why I think that apps like Duolingo don't work is just because they're not meant to work on their own. They're a tool, and learning languages is a very multifaceted experience. I'm not a big fan of Duolingo. I definitely have used it before, and I think that some study, some exposure is better than doing nothing. But on its own, it's just not. Specifically with Duolingo, is that it's just not going to teach you the grammar that you need. And there's linguists, excuse me, that will say that, oh, like with just immersion, with no learning of grammar, you can learn a language because that's how we learn as babies. And there's a lot of others that disagree with that. Our brains change. We don't have as much neuroelasticity after, as we continue to age. But there seems to be a cutoff point around 8 years old. And yeah, babies, obviously, no one teaches babies grammar. They just soak it all up. Um, but for the rest of us, for most of us, we do need to do some studying of grammar while we expose ourselves as well to the language.
What apps? I mean, so we have Duolingo. Are you aware of any other apps that you think are good in terms of trying to learn a language, or do we simply need to have a Spanish teacher? We need to be immersed in, say, the culture in order to learn a language. Can we even learn a language properly through an online app or software?
With just an app, I would say no. And maybe there's someone out there who can prove me wrong,
Not
but
even
I would
Rosetta
say with
Stone?
just using no, so I remember I had a Rosetta Stone, and I used it as my intro to French. I messed around with Latin when I was, I don't know, probably around 20 years old. And yeah, of course you can learn some things. I just don't think by itself anyone's learning a language with just that. The best way to learn as an adult that I'm aware of is through classes and immersion. So if you have the time to move to a place where that's the language everyone's going to be speaking all day while you're taking classes with qualified teachers, that's the fastest way. Now we all don't have that option, and maybe we do have an option to travel a little bit, and we want to. But no one's going to learn a language, and I shouldn't say no one, but most people aren't going to learn a language in 6 weeks either. So let's say you had 6 weeks to go to a country and you want to learn this language. Well, you want to get there with a little bit of a head start. there are things we can do, and we can make progress, and we can make a lot of progress without directly moving, especially now, in the 21st century, because we have so much access to media online and access to other speakers, access to teachers, all of these type of things. So I would say for the people who don't have the luxury of, packing up, moving to the country that they speak the target language, attending an institution or a school in that country, what I would recommend is finding a good teacher, whether that's through a university or online or through private teachers, private tutors. Getting a good book if the teacher doesn't provide you with one, and learning about the grammar, so like a good grammar on whatever the language is, and then working on exposure, exposing yourself. So we can talk about intensive and extensive exposure and intensive and extensive production. So what I mean by that is something like Duolingo, or maybe putting on in the background, a telenovela if you're learning Spanish or sports or whatever it is that you're interested in, and just kind of absorbing it, trying to pay attention, trying to follow along. That's what we call extensive, because you can do a lot of that. Intensive would be, let's say you were learning English. They would be reading an article in the New York Times and looking up every word you don't know. Now, I do think they're both important. One of them's a lot harder, but I think we would get very burned out if we were only doing intensive learning all the time. And I find that like using those two things together, that's kind of what it is that there's no way of getting to learning a language with just using one tool. And using something like Duolingo or something similar is going to be one of those extensive things. If you have some time to kill, you're in the elevator, this or that, you're in a waiting room, and you don't want to scroll through Instagram or TikTok or whatever, yeah, by all means, get on there. You're still using the language. And if you are going to use Duolingo, I really recommend reading out loud everything you do. Um, you know, even if it's not the listening exercise, seeing it, reading it, and then, seeing if you get it right. And more than, or I think maybe to accompany all of these different things, is that what's really important is finding out why you wanna learn the language. Um, Finding a way to connect with the language is what's going to make it possible. So let's say, if you're gonna travel to a place and you're really interested in that culture, well, that's something that can help motivate you. You can find the thing. So you see, I got my records and my books behind me. Maybe that, so I speak Portuguese, I speak Spanish, and Brazil has incredible music. Plenty of countries in Latin America have incredible music. So you have this built-in thing where you don't have to treat it like this intensive homework assignment to be exposing yourself. You can find music on, anywhere online, whatever you want, and start connecting to that. And then when you want to say like you really like a song, be like, I want to know what this song is saying. Well, take some time aside. We have the internet. It's easier than ever to sit down, look up those things. And then especially if you're taking personal classes and not like classes in a university setting, when you don't understand something, that's what you use your teacher for. You go in and say, hey, I don't explain this. Why did they say eh, donde sea instead of donde es, and it's just like, so then that teacher then can help you learn that concept. And, putting all those things together is really what helps make improvement and advance in your language learning journey.
And so perhaps there's a multi-tier approach that one needs to take in order to learn a language, from reading and writing, speaking and listening. And it seems that it's not just about immersion, but it's also understanding the foundation. Can you talk about, say, the difference in, say, what you might teach in a class with a student versus what somebody might learn if they go through the entire course on Duolingo? Like, what are they missing out in, say, an online language platform that they might get through an actual teacher?
A lot. I mean, there's the limitations of just, first off, even just the amount of words that you're going to come across in Duolingo. You're not going to get things explained to you why things are said in this way. So I know they used to have a forum function on there, and that was great because then people would answer each other's questions on there. Um, and that works more in more studied languages as well. I mean, so that's the other thing. So, you're my Spanish student. I've gotten on Duolingo for Irish. I want to learn Irish, and I don't. That's not. It's not on my immediate to do list, but it's a language that I would like to learn. And it's phonetic, but not in our way. So, like, I don't know if you've ever seen anything written in Irish or Irish people's names and things like that. They just seem indecipherable. They didn't have an audio function. So, some of these languages that are less developed, that have less users on there, they really are lacking a lot of the tools where it's just like, okay, well, if you're learning a language, any of the Celtic language, you're learning Welsh, which is like famous for having just dozens of consonants in their words. And I just gave them all, some 20 something letter word to you. You have no idea how to pronounce it. Obviously we need to hear it. We need that exposure. But even in the other languages like Spanish, French, the ones that have a lot of users and have a lot more resources, they don't explain the grammar. They don't explain why things are said in this way. And that's less of a problem in some languages. If you already speak a romance language, especially a Western romance language, so French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Catalan, any of the others, smaller ones that are spoken as well, the grammar is going to be very similar. So, you could probably get more out of a thing like that. Let's say you're a native Spanish speaker and you want to learn Italian. Well, yeah, Duolingo is probably going to help a lot because it's going to help get you those basic words that are different than in Spanish. And, then maybe you could just kind of do a test by fire. Um, you know, again, I'm saying if you were a native Spanish speaker and, these are languages that are very similar, same Spanish, Portuguese, then those tools might be give you a little more, but for the most part, yeah, I mean, I can just give you my experience. So I started learning Spanish in middle school. I don't wanna say it was too boring. I had some really good teachers, but it was your standard experience, learning from the book, "Donde está la biblioteca?" That kind of stuff. For me, though, I have Latin family, so I had people I could practice with. My not in my immediate house, my parents aren't Spanish speakers, but I have aunts and uncles and cousins. And then when I went to university and moved to Texas, I wanted to learn the language so I could practice, I could communicate with my neighbors. I mean, you live here in Texas, it's a very bilingual place. So then, as I studied, I also had to prove I don't remember, a certain semester sufficiency to get my degree in college. And I took another college course, which was just kind of a recap of everything I learned in high school to satisfy that requirement. And then I started making more progress through traveling. Reading, traveling. When I would read, I would highlight words I didn't know and use vocab cards. That was before the apps. Now there's some great apps out there that help streamline that. And then I traveled for about a year and a half. And that type of exposure is yeah, it was just night and day. When I first started traveling to towards the end of that trip, it was just definitely night and day. Even when I started, I could communicate, everything was fine. But by the end, having deep, fulfilling relationships with people who don't speak a word of English just wasn't a problem. Now, on that trip, and this is maybe to answer your question on things like different types of study. I thought I might end up going to Brazil, and I didn't. This thing called COVID happened, and I paused my travels. But later I visited Brazil, and in the meantime, I bought a grammar. I bought a book written for English students, and the implication was that you probably already studied Spanish, and it had some workshop or like exercises in there to practice stuff. It explained the grammar, it explained the pronunciation. I did use Duolingo. I used that. I started watching programs on Netflix and personally, I'm a fan of watching, childhood cartoons and things like that, things with simple again, people like telenovelas, people like sports, something you're familiar with, and watching it, in your target language. If you wanna put subtitles on, put subtitles on in the target language. Then I went to Brazil, and for the first week, I was a little bit of a deer in the headlights, and after being there for a month, I made, relationships, friendships with people who didn't speak any English. And again, those languages are very similar. Now, do I think that I guess I would have it been in my 30s when I did that. Do I think if I would have not learned a second language and just in my 30s bought a book and got on Duolingo and within, less than a year been able to go to Brazil and communicate fluently? No, I don't think so. I think we build on the skills that we have, and especially when the languages are similar, you scaffold off of one where it's like, "Oh, okay, I already understand the grammar more or less. What's different? Oh, look at all these words that are in common. Okay, they pronounce this a little differently." And yeah, we don't have to work as hard if we want to learn a language that's similar.
I love that you mentioned the connection between languages, and I want to get into that. But first, I want to talk about something that is kind of a universal experience when it comes to learning, especially if you're a little bit older as an adult and you start trying to learn a language. Maybe you have a partner now that is fluent in another language. I know, like Mark Zuckerberg learned how to speak Chinese, and that seemed just like, wow, how did you do that? It shows like a certain level of dedication to your significant other in that respect, or if you struggle by trying to speak Spanish because you end up working with a lot of Spanish speakers. And one of the things that I know I encountered is having my first few Spanish lessons, I kind of felt stupid. it felt almost degrading, like, to have this experience where I'm being taught this thing and it's just, like, going right by my head, and after it created this sense of anxiety that just made it so difficult to, like, book the next Spanish lesson, and I know there's probably a whole array of students who just can't get over that anxiety because it just makes you feel like you're kinda dumb if you're trying to learn something at the very beginning. Have you ever encountered this? Have you encountered this with students? What advice would you give?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Um, and I don't think that well, first off, the important thing is to remind yourself that you're not dumb. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work trying to learn another language, and you already have mastered one language, and you're able to do this other one, but it's a lot of work, and it's gonna come easier for some people than others. But even the people it comes easier for, I promise you, they make mistake after mistake after mistake. And they might even make mistakes, dumb mistakes. There are things that they consider dumb mistakes, silly mistakes. Um, once they've already become fluent, I know that I do. I do all the time. I mean, the other day, I said libros instead of libras. That's books instead of pounds. Okay, I know what those 2 words mean. I mean, we do that in English, and we don't think anything of it if we're having this conversation in English. And I think earlier I stuttered on the word linguist. You're not gonna be like, "Oh, this moron, he doesn't know what a linguist is," and we're sitting here talking about um, linguistics. So I think we just have to really remind ourselves that. And yeah, it happens a lot. I first came across it teaching English, and I had a coworker I was teaching in Chile, and she had taught in China for a few years. And so I've heard this kind of commonly in East Asia that people who teach English over there, that their education system values obedience in the children, and it values them being quiet and not speaking out as much. And it also maybe punishes you for getting the wrong answer. So a lot of teachers I have met have trouble eliciting from their students because that's such a huge part of learning how to speak and understand is making mistakes. The fake it till you make it mantra in learning a language, it can't be understated. If you're trying to communicate with people, you have to assume that what they're saying makes sense, even if you don't, and just try to understand it, and laugh about the mistakes that you make. And if anyone is making fun of you, they're probably really insecure
Mm.
person, and probably not like that. I can't promise you no one will ever make fun of you, because there's people out there that will. The majority of them, the grand majority of people, think it's understand how hard it is. And maybe if that I have seen people who will make fun of you for, oh, if you make a mistake when you're learning a language. Those people often don't speak another language.
Mm.
And, we just kinda gotta ignore them. And there's other people who will be thrilled that you're trying to communicate to them in their language, and be very understanding, and we just gotta focus on that. I think the other day we talked about, in our last class, you were a little tired and you were beating yourself up. You're like, "Oh, I'm not really understanding this, and that." And you were doing better in that class than normal. You were making less mistakes than normal, and I think it was because I don't know, maybe it was because you were tired, and that was what I mentioned. Some people feel more confident. They feel like they can communicate better if they're tipsy, if they've had a few drinks. And I think it's because the inhibitions go down, and they stop thinking about, "Oh, how do I sound?" and this and that, and they just try. And I noticed that with my students across the board. I have students who have learned all the grammar there is to learn in Spanish, and they don't have much confidence, and they're very faltering in the way that they communicate. And I have A2 students who I would feel comfortable dropping them off in the middle of Mexico or anywhere, and, they're gonna say some silly things, but it doesn't matter, that's a part of the process of learning. They have the confidence to just try, and, it's just so that is how we learn, and I don't know. There's probably other people who can maybe give better pep talks, but I can promise you that it's something that all language learners feel, and something that we should really try to not judge ourselves about.
Right, and learning a language is like learning anything, and that really, I've heard this said before, is that to learn something new is it's the art of becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? It's only when we're outside our comfort zone, when we're trying to learn something, and so often we veer away from that because it's hard to feel this anxiousness, to feel that potential judgment if we're not actually doing it properly. But there are ways of trying to ease that process. And I know one of those ways is to try to start with an easier language and to work off of that. And I know it's easier to learn Spanish and then Italian and then French. And so it seems like there's a lot of building blocks and a lot of connections between languages. And from what I see here is that as well as 29% of the English vocabulary comes directly from French, thanks to a Norman conquest of 1066. I'm wondering if you can look at and explain some of the unknown connections that exist between different languages.
Sure. First, I just want to add to that that you're absolutely right. Some languages are easier to learn from others because languages are related. So a lot of people will be like, "Oh, Russian is the hardest language, Japanese is the hardest language, English is the hardest language." That there's none of that's true. It's all relative. Learning um, a language that is very similar to another one, some languages are going to be easier, and because they're more related or they use the same writing script. So that's so that would kind of get into what you were asking. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to add to that is that even though that's true, some are easier than others. I think that the number one thing is find a language that you want to learn. There needs to be a reason. I honestly think that, I mean, some people just love learning languages and they probably won't have an issue with that. But most of us, I think, will give up if we don't find an external motivation because it's a long haul. But if you have reasons, like you said, a significant other, let's say you're really into Persian literature, so you want to learn Farsi, that makes sense. If you have no plan on ever going to Iran, you don't know any Persians, you don't care about literature, even if Farsi is not the easiest language to learn, but even if it were, I wouldn't recommend trying to learn it because even the easiest languages to learn, it's quite a lot. It's still a bit of work. But then, yeah, getting onto your question about how languages are related. So linguists study that. They study the evolution of language. They study how they're related to each other and they argue about it quite a lot. But in Indo-European languages, of which English is a part, we have well, in all languages, we use a tree model, kind of like a family tree type thing. It doesn't work as well across all of the language families. Um, it works a lot better with Indo-European languages, and a big part of that is that languages cross and have contact with each other. So to get to your point about the Norman invasion, English is a Germanic language. It's more closely related to German, to the Nordic languages, than to the Romance languages. The Romance languages all came from Latin. French-speaking Normans, they were Germans as well, but they spoke a version of French, invaded England. That's kind of the difference between Old English and Middle English. He said, have all this French vocab come in. So that doesn't really fit the family tree model as well. Um, and so in languages like Arabic, for example, or really all the Semitic languages, you've had so much, they haven't been separated for long enough for that to necessarily work as well, that the tree model, to be as concrete as it is with the Romance languages. But it's a working model. It's still a good way of kind of understanding how close some languages are to others. So yeah, when you're learning, you know, I've seen if you pull out a text, I'm looking just the text in I don't have one in front of me. Since so much of our vocab comes from French, you're at an advantage when you're if you were to learn French from English as opposed to learning yeah, Japanese, which obviously we live in a global world. So a great example, there's pretty much only two words for tea in the whole world. It's either tea or some variation, te in Spanish, or it's sha. And, people spell it differently or this or that, but that's because it was fairly later in human history when people started exporting tea, and it was only exported by a group of pretty much Europeans bringing it to other places, and so they had their interpretation of how it was pronounced from where they got it, and everyone pretty much pronounces it the same. Coffee is very similar as well. So any new technological word that spreads around the world, will come usually from where it is or from who brought it to you. And so we get, English has lots of loan words because of that, but most of our core vocabulary has Germanic roots or French roots, and both of those are Indo-European. So it is going to, for the most part, be much easier to learn an Indo-European language than a non one. And the other things you have to keep in mind is what script are we using? So English, Spanish, French, they all use the Latinate script. What we type in every day. Greeks use the Greek script. Russians use the Cyrillic script. And then there's, Arabs use Arabic uses the and Arabic ajab. which is similar to an alphabet, but they don't write the vowels. Hebrew does that as well. There's syllabaries, there's more pictographic representations. If that's something that's completely different to you, that's obviously gonna take a long time. The government ranks how easy it is to learn a language for their employees, and they put Japanese in the highest tier, for example. And as far as I'm aware, it's in the highest tier because its writing system is so complicated for us. There's not they don't have a particularly complicated grammar. They don't have sounds that we don't make. Um, but if you're gonna learn to write it, I mean, you're starting from scratch. You're learning something completely alien to us as people in the US. So those are like all the things that kind of factor in at why a language could be easier or harder to learn and how they're related to each other.
Right, and from what I understand is that a native English speaker can learn Spanish in about 24 weeks or 600 total class hours, whereas if you try to learn Chinese, it would take 88 weeks or 2,200 class hours. Why? It seems so as I see it, is that Asian languages developed completely separately, whereas it seems a lot of our language in the Americas, it kind of had a Greek or Latin roots.
Well, they didn't originally when when the Europeans got here, they brought their languages. Um, and yeah, for the most part, that's going to be true in Asia. Tagalog in the Philippines has a lot of Spanish influence as well because they were a Spanish colony. Um, the timeline thing, and I wonder about that as well because I know plenty of people who I don't speak any Chinese of any sort, and I know people who've learned Mandarin. And what a lot of folks say is that it's not as hard as you think. They're a tonal language, for example. English is not a tonal language, which means that there's meaning that's carried by the tone of your voice. A certain syllable, whether it goes up or it goes down, means a completely different thing. Their grammar is, for lack of a better word, simpler than English. Um, as far as I'm aware, they don't have tenses. They just have they'll say instead of um, I ran, I run. It's I run yesterday, I run today, and there's plenty of languages that do that as well. Um, Again, with Chinese as well, it's the writing system, and I think if I'm not mistaken, I think it takes on average like a Chinese child like 3 years to learn how to write, and it does not take that long to learn how to write for an English speaking child. Um, so yeah, that's why again people say and people all the time will tell me, oh, it's Spanish is so much harder to learn than English, or English is so much harder to learn than Spanish, and it's just such a subjective experience, and it's subjective to what language you're already speaking, before you learn. For personally, my opinion with Spanish and English is that it's easier the learning curve, it's sharper for English later, and it's sharper for Spanish earlier. Because English is harder to pronounce than Spanish, and we have kind of what seems like no rhyme or reason to a lot of the things that are irregular about our language, whereas Spanish, you're gonna have to learn a lot more conjugations up front to be able to make sense of what you're saying. But the rules are a little more regular and the pronunciation's a lot easier. So again, it's always gonna be a subjective experience based on the individual, what languages you already know and what language you're trying to learn.
And, about the time to learn languages, it's shorter to learn Spanish, but it's interesting that people who know Spanish can learn Portuguese in about a third of the time, if they were trying to learn it from scratch. And there's other studies that seem to indicate that if you're trying to learn a third language, it's typically faster to learn a third language than it is to learn a second language. So you understand 3 languages now. Would you say that's true in most sense?
It's been true in my experience for sure, but especially because Spanish and Portuguese are so similar. What I notice, and I've noticed this, and even to people who don't learn another language, I was in Puerto Rico once, and I ran into a friend down there who was traveling separately, and she had taken French in high school or maybe college, and she did not speak French, but she, had learned some words and things like that. And we were in Puerto Rico, and we go into the store, and she would just start speaking French unintentionally. Like she was trying to piece some things together in Spanish and she was like, "Why is this coming out?" Um, and that definitely happens, and I think it continues to happen with um, the more languages you learn, and it can be frustrating, but I think it's a double-edged sword. It's you learn these other languages faster because you're building off of these understandings that you have, but then you might mix them up. So I spent 6 weeks in Brazil, and I'd already been speaking Spanish for 20 years. I lost my ability to speak Spanish for about 2 weeks. I was speaking Portuñol. I was mixing the 2 of them together, and I flew back from Paraguay, and people were like, "Oh, your Spanish is so good," like, in this kind of, like not in a condescending way, but in, like, a good for you, and I was like, "No, like, I'm, like, fluent in this language that I could not speak." But that same opposite side of it, that was why I was able to learn Portuguese so quickly, and I hear people say that a lot, like, "Oh, I don't want to, like, mess up my languages," and it seems for me to be temporary, and I think the more and more you differentiate and the more and more you use your target languages that you're trying to learn, that will happen less and less. And then also, it just doesn't really matter, unless you're taking an exam. If you say the wrong word for cup or something, then you realize, "Wait, that's not right." Then you just correct yourself, and for the most part, no one's ever gonna really care. I don't know if that answers your.
Yeah, the saddest thing I see is, going to Mexico with some friends, and they have a really good decent understanding of Spanish, but they choose to engage every person in English because they don't want to practice. They don't want to, be in that situation where there's, like, a misunderstanding, and so I think that's, it's always it's whether or not you choose to push the boundary because that's where you're gonna get any kind of growth. And in that
Mhm.
process of, say, learning a language, I'm wondering if you know of any memory tricks that have worked for you. I know that there's things like the memory palace where you envision like a place that you're familiar with and in a room, and you might envision if you're trying to learn like a list of going to the grocery store, you might imagine flinging Coke everywhere in your living room, and then you walk to the kitchen, and then you see a baker baking bread, and you smell bread, and so it's this memory trick of trying to string together various words or things that you're trying to remember. And so, what kind of learning do you think works best? I know everybody's a little bit different, but we have like rote memorization or creating mental images. What kind of memory tricks do you think work the best?
So, in my personal experience and from what I've gathered from other folks as well, is that the memory palace for memorizing vocab just isn't that good of a technique. Now it's a great technique for, like, memorizing numbers, facts, things like that. The main reason being is that it's not going to we don't use words in the same way that we need to recall facts or numbers or things like that. When we're communicating right now in English, and I feel it's safe to say we both probably think in English. English is the medium of our thoughts, and not everyone. Some people think in sounds and stuff like that. The brain is crazy and and very diverse, but for the most part, most people think in language, and so you're trying to learn another language. You're essentially trying to learn another way of thinking. If you're using the memory palace to memorize vocabulary, you're gonna have to go into that memory palace and and pull out those things. And it just doesn't really work in the same way. I would say I don't like using flashcards, but I do. And I've been told about the spaced repetition system, which Anki is a good app that's free for that. So basically, it's, you expose yourself to the cards and the basically the when you feel more and more comfortable with them, you expose yourself to them less, but they still keep coming back. So you still keep they're still in your cycle of words that you're learning. But I think that whether you use that or whether you're just using, handwritten flashcards, the issue is when you get a new set of words, you try to learn them, you try to memorize them, you need to use them. And whether that's in writing a journal, whether that's in reading, those help. The best way is speaking, because we are, we're social animals. And I think that what happens often is maybe you learn a word and it's somewhere in your brain and you can't think of it. And you say, you say how many times there's so many things on the internet, memes and jokes of people with their friends that speak another language, and oh, they speak English perfectly, but they couldn't remember the word for lid, so they called it the "Where's the pot's hat," and something like that. Now, obviously that would give you a laugh. That's a silly image. Well, I bet you that person, when their friends like laughed at them, and not like in a mean way, but they were like, they're what, and they made like a kind of thing about it. That person's probably going to remember the word for lid, and that's why it's important that as we're going through whichever vocab system you want for memorizing these things, that we try to give ourselves opportunities to use them. And yeah, that's where I went back to the extensive and intensive. Even just if you're learning vocab, you'd be surprised how many times those words will then come across, whether in your readings or in what you're watching. And that's why the amount of exposure. That's why the extensive exposure is important as well as the intensive, because the more time that you spend with it around, you're like I remember particularly with the music that I was saying earlier, I've been a fan of Brazilian music since well before I could speak a word of Portuguese. And, the joy of one day understanding the lyrics to some song that I had known for years was just like, "Oh, that's really cool." And, I got those words by, yeah, vocab lists and things like that and studying them, and then all of a sudden, you start picking them up and, yeah, they start to cement in that way, and that's what's been helpful for me.
Yeah, and so you mentioned thinking in a language, and I imagine that most of us, even if we learn other languages, that we still will think in the language that we learned as a baby and a young kid. And I wonder, is there like a tipping point at which so actually let me go back. And anytime I look at Spanish, I if I'm trying to read a sentence, my mind has to translate everything that I'm reading into English for me to understand it. And then if I'm trying to convert that into Spanish, I have to think what is it in English? And then I convert the individual words back into Spanish. Is there a tipping point at which you're able to just say or think and the different language and you're not converting it, or in some ways are you still kind of almost always converting it to some one form or another?
No, you can get to that place where you're thinking in other languages, for sure. And that's the goal. So that's what you wanna be working towards, and again, we don't wanna beat ourselves up, "Oh, we're not there yet, we're not there yet," and, that's how we're gonna get there is translating things and thinking of them. The tipping point for me for Spanish was even though I felt like I had a pretty good I remember I thought like, "Oh, my Spanish is pretty decent," and I went to Puerto Rico for 3 months. I did some woofing down there, which is like the working on organic farms and stuff, and, Puerto Rico is pretty famous for having a hard to understand dialect of Spanish. Oh, I was lost. I mean, and I just struggled through it. And I used that time to just to practice, and in my free time, I was reading and trying to learn new vocab cards while I was there. But no, I think I still was for the most part thinking in English and translating. That's kind of when I realized it. The tipping point for me was when I started spending more time in Mexico, when I started traveling, when in like living abroad, is that I remember, and I've heard this happen to other people at night, even though like you speak very well in your target language. If you have to do it all day, sometimes you just feel exhausted at the
Mm.
end of the day, maybe because you've had a long day, and it just feels like you can't anymore. The good news is that you can. You might maybe start saying some wonky things because 'cause you're tired. We do that in English as well. But you don't actually and this maybe goes back more to what you're saying about the embarrassment stuff. No one's ever died of embarrassment. No one's ever died from frustration, and I think it is very frustrating. But I don't know, it was somewhere around then when I started just fully thinking in Spanish. When I'm in the Spanish speaking world, I'm thinking in Spanish. And I did get to kind of jump that with Portuguese because again, they're so similar. And I mean it didn't happen until I went to Brazil. And I would recommend again for people who can't, just move to a place or just go to a place, or at least at the time they can't, um, talking to yourself in your target language. I highly recommend that. We can't always find the time or the place to be speaking with people in another language, but what we can do is while we're making our breakfast and say we've been learning food words or this or that, just talk to yourself. Just say what you're doing out loud in your target language, and then that's where you're going to start finding the holes. I don't know how to say break an egg, so then you go and look it up, or you go and ask your teacher. And the more and more you do that, the more and more those neurons in your brain, you're forming those pathways where they're thinking of it as like, "Oh, this is the channel for thinking. This is not facts that I need to remember." I need to remember every word on this list as opposed to this is the way I need to think. And I don't know if for me, it kind of happened first with music. I play the guitar, I play the harmonica, and I've never really gotten there. I don't think in guitar, if that makes sense, but I think in harmonica. And I don't know how, maybe if you're a musician, you understand that, but it's like if you give me the instrument, I just I was in high school band and whatnot. I learned how to read music and all of that. I don't think about translating notes on a page to what I'm doing. And I think that people who, can improvise or noodle, they do that. They're just like they're thinking musically. They're not thinking about, oh, well, what's the next chord in this progression and what chord should I play if he plays this chord? And but I think almost all those people start off with that. That's kind of we gotta have an entry point at somewhere. With language, it's yeah, it's translating to yourself until all of a sudden it's just happening automatically.
With language learning, it's changed recently with the advent of AI becoming everything's AI now. I know that with ChatGPT, they recently came out with a tasks feature, and so I can ask it to I can ask it to be a Spanish teacher, and I want it to ask me a question every day at 9 a.m. in Spanish, and I respond in Spanish, and then it tells me what I didn't do right. And so, have you been able to incorporate AI with any of your learning? And where do you see kind of AI taking? Do you think it's going to replace Spanish teachers as a whole, or I mean, teacher and language teachers? Do you think somebody can learn a language just with talking with AI?
I don't know where AI is going to go. Obviously, I'm not an expert in that, and even the experts don't really know. It seems my understanding of AI is that we have these like huge breakthroughs, and then like nothing happens for decades, sometimes afterwards. And then this is going to go back to the same issue with Duolingo is that languages that have a lot of material, Spanish, English, Chinese, people, languages that are written in all the time, those AI systems are going to be a lot better with those. And with, less spoken, less written languages, you're definitely like, if you wanted to learn an indigenous language that is, Quechua is spoken by millions of people. There are about 20 or so Mayan languages, again, spoken by millions of people. How much of those are written? How much written material of those is online? Is it enough for AI to be good? I don't know. But I can tell you, it's not going to be anywhere near as accurate as again with more mainstream languages. The way I don't incorporate it too much. I would say that the biggest thing for me is that it speeds up the process for quick translations, which you would then have to go back and check anyways. But let's say you're kind of confused, it doesn't do better than a dictionary.
Mm.
And now that we have online dictionaries, it doesn't really save that much time either. Now, I won't say that it doesn't help. I mean, it's great to get just like a general overview of you plug something into Google Translate or ChatGPT or whatever. It can help. In my lessons, sometimes I'll use it to generate, if I'm doing conversation classes and someone, I'll say maybe like, let's give us some good talking points on this vocab list. And that's nice. It's a time saver for sure. Will it replace teachers? Probably not. It definitely won't replace. There's been a lot of talk, I think more when like Google Translate first came out, not like with the recent waves of like ChatGPT of people thinking that like translators and interpreters are going to lose their jobs and things like that, or there's no need now to learn another language. And I think that very quickly proved to be false. And again, for low stakes translations between very common languages, it's super useful. Do you know what I mean? But you can't if it's sensitive at all, you can't just put it through the chat and have them give you the right answer. I'll give you a good example of that. There's a joke that Chat GPT, if you pronounce it in French, chat GPT sounds like cat I farted. So people who have like speak French, they'll be talking about ChatGPT on the news in French, and so I think it went viral. I think that someone like noticed this and they put this online. It's just like I'm sitting here watching the news and like the news person just keeps saying cat I farted," and I asked ChatGPT to explain if it understood that, and it didn't. I tried wording in so many different ways. I said, Why is ChatGPT funny to a French speaker?" It couldn't. It could not grasp it, and I explained the joke to it. It still couldn't. So, what's gonna happen in the future? I have no idea. But, learning a language, even Google Translate's never replaced our ability to connect with others, there's definitely it's a great tool. It can help speed up your learning process. But if you want to meet someone, if you want to learn, have an in-depth conversation, if you wanna learn about things, you're not going to let's say you married someone who speaks another language. I promise you guys aren't going to have your phone out every single conversation for the rest of your life and put it through there. You're going to want to have intimate conversations. You're going to want to, be able to face and not have to reach for the dictionary every time. So I don't think there's too much of a concern with it replacing
And so for somebody who's
humans.
serious about learning a new language, what is the recommendation that you would give them? Like, do they have to is it a daily practice? Can you learn just in say 20 minutes of focus work per day? How long is it going to take to have a general understanding of language? And I think if I recall is that most most words that you might use in a language is about 1,000 words. So if you can understand 1,000 words, then you might be able to have an 80% grasp of that language.
I hear a lot of those figures thrown around. The way I look at, well, first off, the more time you put in, the more progress you're gonna make. I would recommend, to answer your first part, it is better for consistent daily practice than big chunks of practice, whether that's 20 minutes a day, whether that's an hour a day, whether you're doing an immersion class 6 hours a day. It's much better to study for 20 minutes every day than 6 hours one day a week and not do anything in between. The more frequency you're, using, the more different techniques you're using, it's gonna build on top of each other, and if you forget things, you remember faster than you learn. So you recall things, and I know people who spoke a language and then lost it, at 1 or 2 years old. Maybe they moved, their family moved from another country. I have family members who have had that situation where Spanish was their first language, and then they stopped speaking it, and they couldn't speak it. But then some of them have gone back and studied, and it just came back so much faster than someone who had never been exposed to it. So that would be my recommendations for, building your study plan. The same things I recommended at the beginning of the interview here. And then for the second part, oh, I'm sorry, you'll have to remind me. I'm trying to remember what you just said.
Yeah, my memory is not as good as it used to be. Um, but I do want to just talk about research that I've seen, and that if somebody doesn't have a huge amount.
That was it. Buzz. That was it. So you said the thing about, like, learning 1,000 words or whatever and for it being 80%. My experience with learning languages has been a lot like going up a staircase. You make all this progress and everything just seems easy and like, wow, you're communicating, and then you just hit a vertical wall. And it feels like you're never gonna move forward, but you do. And with the 1,000 words thing, I don't really know, and again, it's just gonna depend on what your definition of success in learning a language really is. Do you want to be able to ask for the bathroom and, order food? Then yeah, probably a basic understanding of the grammar and 1,000 words is gonna be enough. But if you look at language as, an opportunity to communicate and to explore, you're never gonna get there. In English, we're learning in English all the time, and it's gonna be the same thing in another language that you're learning. And so I don't like that, like, that model of like, "Oh, if you learn 1,000 words, you'll," because what does it mean you'll be able to understand 80% of the language? Does that mean literally 80 out of 100 words you're gonna understand? There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of things that we don't understand, even if you understand 100 out of 100 words. So, yeah, that was the other point that I wanted to get to with that, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and so I think there's like an optimal a window of learning that ranges from 20 to 25 minutes before our attention span starts to drop. And so say if you only have 20 minutes of being able to learn, you might do 5 minutes of reviewing existing material, 10 minutes of new material, and then 5 minutes of practice on that material. And I think the key, as they say, is that you want it to be long enough to make progress, but short enough to fit into your schedule. Would you kind of agree to that kind of like process of a little bit of a review, new material, and then practice?
Yes and no. So, like, I got my, CELTA certificate through Cambridge, and they talk about, they have very specific techniques that they use for teaching. And I think that language, again, it's different than learning, a set of facts or, history or things like that. So I think we really need to vary. If you have, 'cause to counter that point, we tend to not, like, if we're doing an activity, I don't know, I've heard different time periods, but essentially it takes us time to warm up. We get into the flow state, we get into working on something. And so if we're doing something for 5 minutes and then we do something else for 15 minutes and then something else for 5 minutes, we don't ever get into that, like, kind of flow state with the thing. And obviously, again, everyone's learning experience is different. So what I would recommend, especially if you struggle with fitting things into your schedule or with attention, is that prioritize setting aside that intensive stuff. So that's the learning new things. And then in your downtime, that's when you do the more extensive stuff. So that's, oh, I got some spare time, so I'm going to do Duolingo. Oh, I'm going to review something I already know. Oh, I'm going to put on my favorite show, so I'm going to put it on in the language. Because if you take a class, and again, there's different teaching techniques, obviously, but if you take a class, usually if I'm teaching an hour, I only want to work on one grammar point. And, maybe we'll go over the homework or something first. But it's like, okay, there's a new concept and here it is. We're going to work on that. Now, maybe we don't get to it in a whole hour. So the next class, we got to come back to it. But as far as what I will agree with is what you said is that, yeah, finding time to do things daily is much more important than, sitting down and getting a huge chunk. And again, this is a marathon. Learning a language is a marathon. So there's no real shortcuts. There's no like, oh, if I just study all day today for 24 hours straight, then, I'm going to make some real progress. It's, you got to feel it out. If you're completely exhausted, you're probably not taking things in. But back to the point when the other day and you in class, you felt you were really tired and you were frustrated, and yet you were making less mistakes. So the brain's a silly place.
And so just to go into a little bit of a rapid fire Q&A, I'd like to ask, so beyond the usual suspects of Duolingo, Rosetta Stone, I think I've heard another a linguist on YouTube mention, say, a platform like Memrise is a good one that he might recommend. But what are some other resources that you might recommend that people might not know about?
I recommend, so like I said, finding a good grammar book, finding a good teacher, finding material that you want, whether it's on Netflix or on YouTube, and especially I get to YouTube, is that there's a lot of language teachers out there in your target language, and a lot of them made some really good content about learning their particular languages on YouTube. And it's just you just got to search, and I promise you'll find them, and if it's in a common enough language. And another good resource for finding a teacher, especially if you don't live in a place with access to, you're not going to be going to classes in person, or maybe it's even a rarer language, is italki. That's just a good place to find teachers who, teachers or tutors in a wide variety of languages, and you can contract them personally on there. Or if you're learning Spanish, you can always go to Speak Better Spanish, which is where I'm teaching Spanish right now. We do a good job. I hope we do a good job. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think I think you do a great job, and you make it in a way where even if I'm feeling internally insecure about my progress, is that I never feel judgment, and it makes it easy to go to the next class and not have to deal with that anxiety, because it's already one thing to feel like whether or not you're learning anything and you're actually making progress, but it's another thing to not feel embarrassment or judgment from somebody else.
Well, good. I'm glad. I'm glad. I think that, yeah, that kind of judgment and that kind of feeling down on yourself is just it just gets in the way. I don't think there's really any place for that in learning languages or learning anything really.
And, would you say it's a I think it's a common misconception that you need to be young to learn a language?
You don't need to be. It does help. I can't deny it. Things get harder as we get older. Um, we have there's definitely some kind of milestones. Like I said, before you're 8, I think there's another. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a neurolinguistic a linguist. I did meet once I was waiting for a bus in a bar in Chicago, and I met someone, we started talking, and I wish I remembered their name, I wish I was still in contact with this person, but they were doing their doctorate in neurolinguistics, and, their professor firmly believed that the neuroelasticity that children have can be regained, and they were working on that kind of research, so good luck to them. I hope that they not just for learning languages, I'm sure that would cause a lot of breakthroughs in all sorts of fields. But yeah, it's a different experience. I will say that it is different learning a language as a young child than it is learning as an adult. Um, it definitely still can be done. There is no neurological reason why all of a sudden we can't. If anything, it's that self judgment stuff that we've talked about, and then also just time. Just being realistic. When we're older, we have not just the neuroelasticity issues. We have responsibilities. A 3-year-old doesn't really have many responsibilities, so they can focus all of their energy on learning another language. But I don't want it to people to think that, oh, it's impossible. I can't learn it because I'm older. But I also don't want them to. We also that goes hand in hand with going easy on ourselves. It'd be the same if you're exercising. An 80-year-old can exercise. Probably shouldn't do the same. They're not going to get the same gains as a 18-year-old, and that's just, we have biological bodies.
And what would you say is, like, the minimum amount of time that one needs to spend per week in order to learn a language, in a way where they're not gonna lose motivation, and then they're gonna get to a point where they can have conversations in a reasonable amount of time?
I'd be lying to I'd be making it up. It's just gonna be so different from person to person and from language to language. And like I said, if we don't wanna get into this thing, it's just like, even if you found a good routine and then let's say life happens and you miss it for a few weeks, just get back on the horse. And then again, the reason why they'd be so hard to answer is not just because every language is different, every individual is different. Again, it comes down to what is your goal? What do you consider? I still work on bettering my Spanish, and still work on bettering my vocabulary and things like that. And I for how for how well I can speak, people know I'm not a native speaker. Now, people have told me that I was speaking for 5 minutes, and they were like, then they realized I made an error, or I said something in a accent that wasn't very native. They're like, "Oh, this guy clearly is not a native Spanish speaker." But so, it's hard because we don't know where there's not this line where it's just like I have mastered another language. It's always going to be this continuous thing. So I can't really give like an exact timeline, but that's why I like looking at it as, like I said, like that staircase, and just it's a staircase that doesn't have a top to it. um, you're gonna have moments where you feel like you're just breezing through things, and you're gonna hit wall after wall after wall where you're like, "Man, I just can't learn anymore. It's gonna be impossible for me to, get rid of my accent. I'm never gonna always remember this case ending," or whatever it is. But you can keep making that progress if you keep working at it.
And where can people go if they wanna book a session with you or learn or connect with you?
Yeah, so I am on a platform, Speak Better Spanish. It's right now it's Hannah and I who teach, and you can find that online. And I'm sure if you can put the URL to that in the bio, they'll be able to find it there. That would be the best way to reach out to me if you want to. So I teach Spanish, and I'm assuming anyone listening to this in English probably doesn't need an English teacher. But I have taught English before, and if someone is looking for an English lessons, I'm also available for that.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you for joining us for the podcast. And if you're somebody who's listening that you're interested in learning more about languages, you can find all the resources mentioned in the notes on the show. And if you think there's somebody who needs to hear it, please share it with somebody who might benefit from the episode. And otherwise, just thanks for listening to the MindHack podcast, where we explore the routines, mindset, and experiences that lead to a successful life. Until next time.